Finally, we arrive at the age-old question, what is the meaning of life? I want to start over here in the top left corner where I've highlighted two key points that I want to come back to as the core message. The first is that everything is a cycle within a cycle. And if you haven't watched the Great Cycle video yet, I recommend going back and doing that now because that'll help give you some context about what I mean and why I believe that. The second is that no state is sustainable. And I've got the quote here, "This too shall pass," which I find to be an infinitely wise saying. So, what are the states that we can experience that I'm saying are not sustainable? Well, there's positive, negative, and neutral are the three basic states. Now, obviously, with the complexity of the human universe and experience, there are more states than just these, but if you simplify those states, everything boils down to or finds its root in these three states: positive, negative, and neutral. And I've got some examples here. Pleasure and hope can be considered positive states. And again, positive just means above the neutral level. Neutral or indifference would be considered a neutral level or non-experience. And pain, fear would be considered negative experiences below the neutral level. So everything is a cycle within a cycle. And that's part of why no state is sustainable. Because if we think about the fundamental equation, there's that dual and non-dual aspect of existence, where this side constantly becomes this side and this side constantly becomes this side, right? So everything decays back to neutrality. And what I mean by that is, no matter what you have in the universe, what state you are in, whether it's positive or negative, if it is not neutral, it will eventually decay back to neutral. So regardless of whether it's positive, negative, like this, it all decays back to a neutral state. So no state is sustainable because that neutral state also spits back out polarity. Meaning that regardless of what state you're in, if you're in a positive or negative state, you're going to decay back to a neutral state. And the neutral state essentially decays. I don't think decay is the perfect word there, but we'll use it for now. The neutral state essentially decays back into a polarized or dual state. So regardless of what state you find yourself in, this too shall pass. That state will not last. So what can we take away from this? Well, one thing we can take away from this is that I don't believe in heaven or hell. Heaven and hell, I would, in my model, would say are temporary states that feel permanent through perception. It's a state that we believe, so if we think about hope and fear, if you believe that it's going to last forever, then you are experiencing the maximum amount of hope or fear. If you're in a really good place, if you're having a great time, let's say we're coming up, it's summer, right? So from the neutral state, we're gaining, we're having a positive experience. Life is good. If you believe during this process that that's going to last forever, that life is just always going to keep getting better and better and better, then that hope is so strong that you will believe that you're experiencing heaven. So that heaven is, to me, a temporary state of belief. But when you reach the top of that and things start to get worse, they start to fall back toward neutral, you've got a long way to go before you hit the bottom of winter. And that, believing that this is going to last forever, would be my concept of hell. But neither of them will last forever. Because again, we come back to spring and the process starts all over again. It's always this flow from positive to neutral to negative to neutral to positive to neutral, so on and so forth. So if we look at this diagram over here, a lot of people, myself included, have looked at life and wondered, how can God be good? How can life be good? How can you say that life is balanced? Life doesn't look like this to me. Life looks like a slide downward, and I see things like children dying of cancer, and I ask, how do you explain that? How do you defend that? Well, first of all, I wouldn't defend it, but what I would say is that, or how I would explain it, is that everything is within a greater context. Every cycle is within a greater cycle. So if you think about, if we were to take this little section right here and we were to zoom in on it, what it would look like is this, right? This does not look balanced. This looks like a downward slide, a negative experience. And if this is one whole life, then we might say, this looks really bad. This looks like a horrible life to live. How is that life balanced? And what I would say is that each individual life does not necessarily have to be balanced, right? If we think about the fundamental equation, the x's can break down into anything, right? So if we do something like 50 plus 50, this is not balanced. This is 100, right? So this one individual aspect of this equation does not equal 0. It is not balanced overall with the whole. But in order to return back to the whole, it needs to find its counterpart, which means that its counterpart must already exist. Do you see why I make this assumption? In order for everything to be part of the whole, everything must balance out. So over on the other side, there must be something that equals negative 100 in order for this to work. If it comes from the whole, it has to be able to come back to the whole, right? We've talked about the puzzle concept, where no matter how you cut up the puzzle pieces have to go back together. So, in order for all this to return to the whole that it came from, the state of nothingness, the state of equality or neutrality, these two sides, the x and the x, the positive x and the negative x, have to balance out. That's why it's x minus x, not x minus y, right? Because it has to be the same in the end. So, because we know that looking at this, that this is not balanced, we can say, okay, well, non-balanced experiences can exist, right? We can suffer and die. I'm sorry. I'm sure you already knew that before I told you, but that sucks, and it's possible. But that will always exist within a greater context, within a greater cycle that will balance it back out. And that's not me saying that within one lifetime, you have to experience balance. There's no guarantee of that. We can see that around us. What I'm saying is that within the greater lives that we will live, it will all balance out. So if you think of it kind of like a, I don't think it's a great example, but if you think of it kind of like I think they're called Fabergé eggs, right? That fit into each other. As they slot back into each other, in order for it all to go back into the biggest egg, it all has to be put together, right? The tops and the bottoms all have to go back together. So when we put it all back into the big box of nothingness, it all has to equal neutral. So there's no way that you can ever get back to that final state of neutrality. And I say final because it's the highest layer of mind, or the deepest layer. It doesn't really matter which direction you go in. But it's the ultimate layer of mind before we spit back out into a new experience of polarity and duality, right? So in order for it all to kind of neatly fit back into the egg of nothingness, it all has to be balanced out, which means that you will experience, before you experience going back in the box, so to speak, you will experience the opposite of everything else you've experienced until it balances out. Now, it doesn't have to be the exact opposite, right? Just like the fundamental equation does not have to balance out with 100 minus 100, right? It can be, for example, 50 plus 50 minus 25 plus 75, right? This is still a balanced equation, even though these individual numbers are not all the same. It doesn't have to be 50 plus 50 minus 50 plus 50. And this can break down into so many different complex variations. So if you look at each of these individual numbers as representing a life, for example, they don't necessarily have to be the exact same experience. So just because it all adds up in the end does not mean that if you have one horrible life, that you have to have another really, really good life. It could be one horrible life and then a bunch of sort of good lives. All that I'm saying with in my opinion, certainty, or at least I should say with high confidence, is that it will all add up to neutral or zero. It has to, according to me and my model. So, with that being said, going back to this kind of diagram over here, if this is one life and we say, oh, we just suffer and die, it was horrible, this is the child dying of cancer, right? It's just a bad experience and then boop, it's over. You have to put that in the context of the greater cycle, which does balance out. And I'll use an example of a dream. if we have a nightmare, right? Let's say this is the dreaming mind. This outer layer right here is the dreaming mind. And this inner layer right here is the dream world. And this circle is the dream, the dream character. If this character has a really bad experience within this world, that might say that this world is negative, right? But when we come out of this dream, we come into a different context. Okay, so the self is flowing back and forth between the internal and external worlds. And so within this one dream, we might call this a nightmare. But what happens when you wake up from a nightmare? Could you wake up into another nightmare? You could. It's possible. But it'll all balance out in the end. But what happens most of the time? You wake up from the nightmare where this experience could be absolutely horrible and horrifying, and you wake up into the waking world and you say, oh, it's not the same anymore, is it? The nightmare doesn't feel the same because it's a different context. So no matter how good or bad your life feels, remember this too shall pass, and remember that there's going to be a different context. It's not going to be within the same context. You don't wake up from the nightmare still believing that you're the character within the nightmare. You wake up from the nightmare believing you're a different character, having a different experience within a different context. So if you wonder, well, how could this possibly balance out? You just have to remember that there are so many layers and levels to all of this. It's so complex, according to my model, that there's no way to predict how it's going to balance out. Just know that it will balance out. Okay? So let's get into desire and part of how we carry over sort of the remainder, so to speak, mathematically, into a new world. Okay, so when we're thinking about how this all balances out, and we're using the analogy of dreams. So our dreams come from our unconscious mind. And remember the diagram here where inside the circle, closest to the center would be the conscious mind, and the barrier is sort of the subconscious mind, and then outside is the unconscious mind, right? Dreams, all experience really, but we're using dreams as this analogy. Dreams are a flow of information from the unconscious mind toward the conscious mind. And so it's coming from the darkness, using the light metaphor, right? Where the center of the light is consciousness, and then the light dims as the gradient goes outward, and then we get to a point where we lose light and it becomes darkness. That darkness that the dream is coming from, the unknown, is the unconscious mind. So the unconscious mind stores information. And the unconscious mind is storing information based on your experience. So again, each layer has its own unconscious mind, and each layer is contained within the unconscious mind of the layer above. So if again, we use the dream analogy, right? If I'm dreaming, if this is my waking mind, then when I descend into a dream, this dream is made of information that is part of the waking mind, that is contained within my waking mind, within my waking unconscious, I should say, which is part of the mind. So the dream is made of or written by my unconscious mind from my waking self. And that's the dream world. That's what it's made of. That's how the story is written. And then my conscious self within the dream is interacting with my unconscious from my sleeping self, we'll say, the mind that's asleep. And so when we talk about desire stimulates polarity, what I'm talking about is the idea that this concept of desire is kind of the same concept as karma, right? And so it's also the same concept as tension. Like if you think of like a spring, right? If the spring, that is a horrible spring, I'm sorry. If the spring is not compressed, then there's very little to no tension in the string, right? But if we compress the spring into something like this that's coiled tightly, then that spring now contains the information, the energy that was put into it in order to compress it. So that's tension, okay? That's karma, my concept of karma. I'm not talking about the Dharmic religions. I got the word from them, the concept only vaguely. So in the same way, your experience of living is compressing information into your unconscious mind, and that information decompresses and manifests into your conscious mind through things like dreams, thoughts, feelings, etc., experience, so on and so forth. So if we take this same kind of concept and put it over to the idea of like the concept of samsara, right? Again, dharmic concept of birth, death, and rebirth, cycle of reincarnation. Whoops. Let's reincarnate that. Okay, so if we take this concept of tension and we put it into death and birth, if we have a mind and we die, then all the experiences of that mind, of that life, were being fed into the mind that is outside of or contained that mind. Just like the waking self contains the dream, right? The character who lives and dies is contained within a greater mind until we get up to the infinite mind, which contains all other smaller minds. So this waking, this death, so to speak, depending on what layer it's at and the information contained within the greater mind. So remember, if we're looking at the fundamental equation, oops, yikes. If we're looking at the fundamental equation, each of these layers, right, like if we think of like the whole parentheses concept where we're going more and more complex, and you can get even more complex than that where you're adding the parentheses together and so on and so forth, all of it eventually equals the nothingness state, right? So eventually, that's what I mean by the ultimate mind. Eventually, we're going to go to a mind that contains everything, which is the nothingness mind, okay? But prior to that, we are in states of mind that are forms within the ultimate mind. So we talked previously about how, wow, what the hell? We talked previously about how each layer of mind contains other layers of mind, right? That's how the universe is created, is by the interpretation of nothingness into forms. And so these minds are essentially forms. And using the dream analogy again, these minds are essentially dream characters that believe themselves to be the mind, but in reality, they are forms being observed by the mind. And that form contains information, and that information is that sort of cup we talked about, right? Where as you pour water into it, as you pour mind into it, the mind is essentially shaped by, or the experience of the mind is shaped by what the mind believes it is. So this is the point of view, right? The cup is the point of view. The point of view can be within itself, within the mind, just like a dream character is a point of view within your own mind. I know this is really complex, but hopefully it makes sense. So everything is eventually going to come back out of the character into the mind. And then what is created in minds below it is always going to be created based on what information is in the mind above it. So in the same way that a dream is created from the information within the dreamer's mind, so too is reality created by the information and the interaction of the information contained within the mind that is above that reality. There's very little difference between the dream metaphor and how reality actually works, in my opinion. It's just a little bit of technicalities. But ultimately, I believe it works fundamentally the same. So, if we think about karma and tension, where this is all leading, let's say that we have a negative experience, right? So this dream has a negative experience. That negative experience goes into this mind, right? Just like your dream becomes a part of your memory, your experience, your conditioned mind. So the one life, we'll call it the micro life, becomes an experienced part of the macro life, and therefore part of the macro life's unconscious state and mind. And contained within that unconsciousness is the tension between the balance of negative, positive, and neutral. Okay? So I don't know if this is going to be too complicated, but if we think of the way this all boils down, right? You can think of this one life as one parentheses, one smaller equation contained within the parentheses, and whatever information is here also has to add up with all the information contained outside of it, which ultimately has to add up to the left side of the equation, right? So the right side of the equation has to add up to the left side of the equation. And what I'm telling you is that the right side of the equation is all the information contained within the whole, which is the left side of the equation. So all the individual parts of the whole are all the x's within the zero, if that makes sense. Which means that the universe created, when you go deeper within yourself, is based on the universe that's, or the information that's already contained. And because our past lives affect the tension or the state that we are in within the greater balance of the whole, that leads to something like karma, where how our previous lives affected us will have to balance out with our future lives in order to create a neutral existence. Because existence is ultimately neutral. It's ultimately zero. So I know that was a really, really like long-winded sort of way of describing this, but hopefully that kind of brings it full circle back to the concept of how does it all balance out, right? Who's to say that if someone has one really bad life, that they should necessarily have a good life later on? Or that if they have a bad life now, they might have had a good life in the past. How do those two characters relate to each other? Well, it's not necessarily the characters that relate to each other. It's the characters within a greater whole that relate to each other. Because those characters are part of the unconscious of one character that created those two characters. So they're like smaller books within a bigger book, or a bigger series of books, a bigger story. And so it does all add up. So with this being true, if everything I'm saying is correct and true, what do we make of this? Do we believe that the ultimate truth is like moksha or nirvana, some concept of just aiming for neutrality? Well, like I said, I don't believe that any state is sustainable. So the idea for me personally of trying to achieve a specific state is sort of futile, because whatever state you achieve will change. And because all of your information is stored within characters, within minds that are nested within other minds, you're eventually going to lose that information when you ultimately become a state of nothingness again, before you eventually spit out new characters from that state of nothingness. So even your memories, even your knowledge will eventually go away. So the idea that we're going to become enlightened and remain in a state of enlightenment forever, I don't believe that's possible. Because how could you remain in a state of enlightenment if all the information and memories that led to your state of enlightenment, that led to your knowledge and your ability to say, this is the correct way to live and be, is eventually erased? Because when we reach that state of nothingness, the left side of the equation, right? When we reach that left side of the equation, all information is the same, which means that there is essentially the equivalence of no information. That's why it's zero. That's why it's a state of nothingness, not a state of somethingness. So in that state, there's no way to differentiate one memory from another, or a right or a wrong idea, etc. So there's no way to become enlightened permanently in my model. So what do we do then? Is it maybe absurdism, where we just say, this is all pointless and ridiculous, let's just kind of rebel and try to do our best? I mean, sort of. I'm sort of an absurdist. I believe that it's sort of like a sandbox game. If you're familiar with any sandbox games, the concept of a sandbox game, if you imagine like a child playing in a sandbox, it's sort of imagination, right? Where there's really nothing outside of the sandbox, and there's nothing in the sandbox dictating, saying, this is the correct way to play in the sandbox. There's no rules really to the game, except for the rules dictated by the nature of the universe, right? Like everything has to balance, so on and so forth. No state can be sustainable forever, so on. Except for those concepts, there's no dictation saying you have to live this way. Like, I don't believe in the 10 Commandments. I don't believe in any specific rules. Now, there are guidelines that can help you live a happier life or a better life, or guidelines that can help you experience one thing versus another. We'll get into that in a moment. But overall, there's nothing that says you have to live a life one way or another. There's no true right or wrong in my model. It's all contextual. It's all relative, subjective. So what do we do in a sandbox game where there are no rules and we can just sort of do whatever we want, but not really, because within the context of the game, there are still laws. There are still, like, just because there's no rules to the universe, so to speak, doesn't mean that there's no rules to your country or to your community or for your body, things like that. Like if you eat unhealthy, you'll still probably become unhealthy. So that's in essence a rule or a guideline that says if you do this, there will be a consequence, right? So there's still that sort of interaction between the elements that dictates consequence, cause and effect. So for me, the correct way, or not the correct way, the how I interpret the sandbox analogy is to say that it is about expressing yourself through the different ways that you can return back to neutrality. So you have a character, right, which is what you think of as yourself, your identity, your ego, and that character is going to go through life, and that life may be a very, very long time before it returns back to the void eventually and recycles itself. So interpreting that character and saying, what does my character want? Who is my character? Right? Think of yourself almost like an actor, like a method actor, trying to ask yourself, who is this character that I'm trying to portray? What are their desires? What are their dreams? What are their goals? What are their values and morals? Personal expression. That is what there is to do in a sandbox game. You can't win at a sandbox game. That's the point that I'm trying to make. You cannot win at life, and you cannot lose at life. You can only live. And no matter what you win, how much money you accumulate, how much fame you accumulate, how smart you become, it will eventually return back to nothingness. So, while you exist as this character, while you are having this sort of dream, in my interpretation, the meaning of life is essentially trying to understand your character and portray that character authentically in the most meaningful way possible. And that meaning is relative to your character. Your character, remember, your character is like a cup. It's like a lens through which we experience and view reality. So the meaning comes not from the universe itself. The universe itself has no meaning. The universe doesn't dictate how you have to behave or like what morals you have to have, what values you have to have, etc. The universe only provides experience, provides separation and duality and cycles. And as you go through these cycles, it's up to you to decide how to express your character. And you have to balance things like individual versus collective interests, right? And you have to balance things like the past, the present, the future. So for example, if you say, okay, well, my character wants to go out and steal. Okay, well, I can't stop you from that. And chances are that nothing I could say would ever change anybody's mind to become someone other than who they are. But you can introduce people to or remind them of the concept of consequences and say, look, there is a constantly shifting landscape of valuation happening where, yes, you could steal, and in the immediate future, that might benefit you. But it'll also hurt someone else within the collective, within the community. So it's not like you're gaining something necessarily. You're taking something away from somebody else in order to gain it. So, there's still that balance within the system. And on top of that, you might get caught. You might regret it. That person might need what you stole from them. And that might cause their family really bad hardships. So you can't just think about, okay, so expression means doing whatever the hell I want, whenever the hell I want to, right? No, there has to be a balance between these opposites. Just like there's a balance between the opposites in the fundamental equation, there has to be a balance between opposites within, there doesn't have to be, but I'm recommending, within your personal expression. So logic and emotion, for example, physical and spiritual, happiness and sadness. It's not, in my opinion, ideal to always just try to pursue as much pleasure as possible. I think that we have to appreciate sadness. We have to learn to, we don't have to, but I recommend learning to appreciate sadness because it is part of this cycle. It is part of the seasons of life. And if we didn't have lows, we couldn't have highs. So again, coming back to the concept of balance, right? Where everything does balance out and there's reason, there's beauty behind that. It may not be the meaning that we wanted. It may not be this sort of happy ending, so to speak. I think what a lot of us, especially coming from religious backgrounds, want or wanted was this idea of, well, yeah, things are hard right now, but don't worry because it's all somehow just going to become amazing and we're all going to go to heaven and everything's going to be good forever. But like I said, I don't believe that any state is sustainable. I don't believe in heaven or hell. Those are just perceptions, temporary perceptions. So I think that story, that religious story, is somewhat wrong. Maybe we'll get into another time about what I think it really means and why the human unconscious produced those stories collectively. But for now, I want to end this video by simply saying everything is a cycle within a cycle. No state is sustainable. And all you have is your character. So learn about your character and learn to express your character in the most meaningful way that you can find. Because eventually that character will end one way or another. And you'll become a new character. So you can't cling to the character indefinitely. And you can't cling to any state indefinitely. All you can do is sing your song, and then eventually the song ends. So make your song the most beautiful song that you can. Live your life the way you want to live it. And that's it. That's really all I have to say. I guess in terms of what's next for this channel and these videos, I'm going to wait and see. It took a lot of energy to produce these. I do not consider these first 10 videos high quality, and I apologize for their low quality. It was difficult for me to kind of get them out. I know I ramble a lot, and I apologize for that as well. But part of the reason why these come out in such a rambling manner is because I don't do a lot of editing. I don't write scripts ahead of time. This is all just sort of flow of thought, which does reduce the quality. It does make it a little bit more natural and authentic, but it does reduce the quality. And the reason I had to do that is because I knew that if I tried to make it perfect, if I tried to write the scripts and edit the videos and all that, that I wouldn't do it because I didn't have the mental or emotional energy for it. So I did the best that I could, and I hope that these videos have helped somebody, even if it's only one person, have a new concept of life and reality, and hopefully it's one that makes them feel better and feel comforted. Maybe not, but I can't run from the truth. This is rational hope. It's not just hope, it's rational hope. So I did my best to portray what I consider the truth in a hopeful and positive narrative while doing my best not to avoid what I consider to be true or real. So future videos, I don't know yet. I do have some videos that I could make, but we'll have to see how much energy I have and whether or not anybody cares about any of these videos, and I'll go from there. I did want to give one shout out, special thanks to Brenna for helping me kind of organize my thoughts. I know they may not seem particularly organized, but trust me, they were even worse before she helped me. So thank you to Brenna. And with that, I wish you all good luck and a good life, and enjoy your sandbox game.